Blood dripped onto the pristine white tablecloth, but it was not from the rare filet mignon. It was from the serrated steak knife Leo Costello had just driven straight through his own palm, his dead, shark-like eyes fixed on the man daring to hold his maid's hand. The Costello estate sat like a fortress on the edge of Lake Michigan, a sprawling architectural monolith of dark stone, bulletproof glass, and secrets buried deep in the frozen Chicago earth. Inside this fortress, Clara Higgins was a ghost in a black uniform and a white apron. She was not the sort of woman who usually occupied the high-end orbit of the Chicago outfit. Clara was thick, soft, and deeply curved, carrying her weight in her wide hips and heavy breasts. She did not have the sharp, starved elegance of the mob wives who occasionally drifted through the foyer, nor did she possess the terrified, shrinking demeanor of the other domestic staff. Clara possessed something far more dangerous: utter indifference. Before she was scrubbing blood out of priceless Persian rugs for the Costello Syndicate, Clara had been a trauma nurse at Cook County Hospital. She had spent a decade holding the hands of dying men, patching up gangbangers, and looking pure human cruelty in the eye without blinking. She lost her license when she took the fall for a fatal medical error committed by an exhausted, overworked resident who reminded her of her little brother. Disgraced and desperate for quiet, she took a job through a discreet agency. That was how she ended up dusting the mahogany bookshelves of Leo Costello. Leo was the don of the Costello family, a man whose name was whispered with a mixture of reverence and absolute terror in the grimy alleys of the South Side and the glittering boardrooms of the Loop. He was a violently unyielding man, built like a heavyweight boxer and scarred by a lifetime of brutal ascensions. He trusted no one. He destroyed his enemies with a cold, calculated efficiency that left the FBI perpetually scrambling and the rival Falco family bleeding out in the streets. Yet in the presence of his soft, curvy housekeeper, the apex predator of Chicago was reduced to a silent, brooding watcher. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways. Clara would be in the study, her plush figure stretching to reach the top shelf, and she would turn to find Leo standing in the doorway, the heavy oak door completely silent. He would not speak. He would just watch her, his dark eyes tracking the slope of her waist, the fullness of her thighs beneath the conservative cotton uniform. When a rival crew sent a message by leaving a severed head in a box on the estate steps, the rest of the staff had hysterics. Clara had simply fetched a heavy-duty trash bag, donned latex gloves, and calmly asked Leo if he wanted the box burned or bleached. That was the exact moment Leo Costello realized he was entirely, terrifyingly obsessed with her. He began leaving things for her. A vintage medical encyclopedia left open on the kitchen island. A box of outrageously expensive French pastries that just happened to be her favorite flavor. He fired the head butler because the man had spoken sharply to Clara about her mopping technique. Clara noticed these things, of course. Her situational awareness was born of emergency rooms and violent men. But she chose to ignore the heavy, suffocating weight of his attention. She was a maid. He was a monster. There was no universe where bridging that gap ended well for her. The fragile equilibrium shattered on a brisk Tuesday morning. Clara was in the formal dining room, polishing the silver. Leo was sitting at the head of the long table, nursing a glass of bourbon despite the early hour. He had just returned from a basement interrogation, his knuckles raw and bruised, a faint smear of arterial spray on his otherwise immaculate white collar. Clara handed him a warm, damp towel without a word. He took it, his rough fingers deliberately brushing against her soft ones, He held on a fraction of a second too long. "You are not scheduled for the weekend rotation," Leo said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in Clara's chest. "No, sir," Clara replied, keeping her tone perfectly level. She pulled her hand back, tucking it into her apron pocket. "I requested Saturday evening off. Maria is covering my shift." Leo leaned forward, the muscles in his broad shoulders tensing beneath his tailored suit. "And what requires your attention on a Saturday evening, Clara?" It was highly inappropriate for an employer to ask, let alone a Mafia don, but denying Leo Costello information was akin to stepping in front of a freight train. Clara met his eyes, refusing to shrink. "My sister set me up on a blind date. I am going to dinner." The temperature in the room plummeted. The silence that followed was not merely quiet. It was a physical weight pressing down on Clara's lungs. Leo stared at her, his expression entirely blank, but Clara saw the infinitesimal twitch of his jaw. She saw the way his large hand tightened around the crystal bourbon glass until she was certain the thick glass would shatter into dust. "A date," Leo repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Yes, sir, just drinks and dinner." Leo slowly set the glass down. He looked at her curves, at the soft line of her throat, and then up to her steady, intelligent eyes. "I see. Enjoy your evening, Clara." He stood up and walked out of the room. 2 hours later, Clara heard the unmistakable sound of Leo's enforcer, a ruthless man named Tommy, being thrown violently through a plate glass window in the training room. The message was clear to anyone who understood the language of the house. The Don was in a murderous rage. Saturday evening arrived with a biting chill that swept off the lake. Clara stood in front of her small mirror in her modest apartment, smoothing down the emerald green dress she had chosen. It hugged her thick waist and flared over her wide hips, the deep neckline hinting at the heavy curve of her breasts. She felt exposed. She was used to the armor of her scrubs or her maid's uniform. Stepping out into the civilian world to meet a stranger felt infinitely more dangerous than navigating the blood-soaked halls of the Costello estate. Her date was a man named Arthur. Her sister had met him at a banking convention. He was supposedly a junior executive at a wealth management firm, safe, boring, and entirely detached from the criminal underworld. It was exactly what Clara needed to remind herself that normal life still existed. The location was the Brass Bull, a high-end steakhouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood, known for its dim lighting, blood-red leather booths, and severe exclusivity. Clara arrived precisely on time and was escorted to a corner booth. Arthur was already there. He was conventionally handsome, with slicked-back blonde hair and a sharp, overly eager smile. "Clara," he said, standing up and looking her up and down. His eyes lingered on her chest for a fraction of a second before meeting her gaze. "You look abundant. I mean, beautiful. Very beautiful." Clara took her seat, offering a polite, tight smile. "Thank you, Arthur. It is nice to meet you." The first 20 minutes of the date were excruciatingly mundane. Arthur talked at length about his golf handicap and his aggressive portfolio strategies. Clara drank her red wine, her mind involuntarily drifting to the dark, quiet library back at the estate and the intense, brooding man who occupied it. She mentally scolded herself. She was here to escape Leo Costello, not fantasize about him. But as the appetizers were cleared, Clara's trained instincts began to prickle. The hairs on her arms stood up. It was a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the kind she used to feel in the ER right before a gunshot victim was wheeled through the double doors. She casually glanced around the restaurant. The Brass Bull had been nearly full when she arrived. Now, The tables closest to their corner booth were entirely empty. The patrons had not just finished their meals, they had practically fled, leaving half-eaten steaks and full wine glasses behind. The waitstaff were hovering near the kitchen doors, their faces pale, deliberately avoiding looking at the center of the room. Clara's eyes drifted to a booth 2 tables away, situated perfectly in the shadows. A man sat there alone. He wore a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than Arthur's entire yearly salary. A bottle of incredibly rare whiskey sat on the table, untouched. His forearms rested on the white tablecloth. It was Leo. Clara's breath hitched, her heart slamming against her ribs. Leo was not looking at her. His dead, dark eyes were fixed with a terrifying, unblinking intensity directly on Arthur. Arthur, completely oblivious to the apex predator sitting 20 feet away, leaned across the table. "So, Clara, your sister mentioned you work in domestic services, housekeeping for some rich guy out in Lake Forest." "I am an estate manager," Clara corrected softly, her eyes darting back to Leo. Leo slowly picked up the heavy, serrated steak knife from his table setting. He did not look at the knife. He just held it, his large thumb testing the dangerously sharp edge. Right, Arthur chuckled, taking a large gulp of his martini. "But honestly, working for those old money types must be weird, right? Do you ever see any shady stuff? I hear some of those Lake Forest estates are owned by some pretty unsavory characters." Clara felt a cold drop of sweat slide down her spine. Her mind raced. Why was Arthur asking about her employer? Her sister knew Clara worked for a wealthy family, but she did not know the name Costello. Clara had made sure of that. "My employer is a private man," Clara said, her voice dropping an octave, entering the calm, authoritative register she used to command bleeding patients. "I just cleaned the house, Arthur." Arthur smiled, but the warmth did not reach his eyes. "Come on, Clara. A smart girl like you must see things. Financial documents left out, blueprints, security schedules." Clara froze. The mundane mask of the date melted away instantly. Arthur was not a wealth manager. No civilian asked those specific questions. The subtle tightening of Arthur's shoulders, the way he kept his right hand resting out of sight beneath the table. He was carrying a weapon. He was pumping her for information. He was a scout, likely working for the Falco family, trying to find a vulnerability in the Costello fortress. Before Clara could formulate a plan to excuse herself and run, movement caught her eye. At the solitary table, Leo's patience had evidently snapped. Arthur reached across the table, his hand clamping down aggressively over Clara's soft fingers. "You can tell me, Clara. I can make it worth your while." The sound of metal piercing meat echoed through the suddenly silent restaurant. Clara gasped. Arthur jumped in his seat, finally looking past Clara's shoulder. Leo Costello had driven his steak knife directly through the center of his own left palm, pinning his hand to the wooden table beneath the pristine white cloth. Blood immediately began to pool, blooming like a dark red rose against the fabric. Leo did not flinch. He did not make a sound. He simply kept his right hand wrapped around the hilt of the knife, his eyes burning with a psychotic, jealous rage as he stared at Arthur's hand resting on Clara's. "Take your hand off my property," Leo said. His voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It carried through the dead silence of the restaurant like a judge's final sentence. Arthur turned pale, his eyes wide, as he looked at the blood dripping off the edge of Leo's table and splashing onto the mahogany floor. "Who the hell are you?" Arthur stammered, his bravado entirely vanishing. Clara did not panic. The old trauma nurse in her saw the blood and calculated the wound trajectory. He had missed the major arteries, sliding the blade cleanly between the metacarpals. It was a calculated act of pure, unadulterated intimidation. "Arthur," Clara said softly, pulling her hand free from his trembling grip. "If you want to live to see tomorrow morning, I suggest you walk out that door right now and never return to Chicago." Arthur looked from Clara's stone-cold face to the bleeding Mafia Don, who was now slowly pulling the steak knife out of his own hand, the serrated edge making a sickening, wet sound. Leo stood up, ignoring the blood pouring down his cuff. He was a mountain of violence, wrapped in Italian wool, and he began walking toward their booth. Arthur did not wait. He scrambled out of the booth, knocking over his martini glass, and bolted for the exit, nearly tripping over his own feet in his desperation to escape. Clara remained seated. She reached into her small clutch purse, pulled out a clean linen handkerchief, and waited as Leo Costello came to a halt beside her table. The air smelled of metallic blood and expensive cologne. "You ruined my date," Clara said, her voice perfectly calm, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached up and pressed the linen cloth firmly against the bleeding hole in Leo's palm. Leo looked down at her, his chest heaving. The manic violence in his eyes slowly receded, replaced by an overwhelming, possessive heat as he looked at the way the green dress hugged her curves. "He was a Falco rat," Leo breathed, his large, uninjured hand coming up to gently cup Clara's cheek, his thumb smearing a drop of his own blood against her soft skin. "And even if he wasn't, I would have killed him for looking at you." The drive back to the Lake Forest estate was cloaked in a suffocating silence. The armored SUV tore through the dark, winding roads, the heavy engine growling beneath them. Clara sat in the spacious back seat next to Leo, her hands maintaining a steady, unyielding pressure on the blood-soaked linen wrapped around his palm. He did not pull away. He simply stared at her profile, his breathing heavy, his dark eyes tracking the soft rise and fall of her chest. When the heavy iron gates of the Costello estate parted and the vehicle slid into the underground garage, the chaotic energy of the syndicate was already buzzing. Armed men in dark suits were moving with frantic purpose. Word had reached the compound that the Don had been bleeding in public. Clara ignored the men who rushed forward with their weapons drawn. She kept her grip on Leo's wrist and pulled him toward the private elevator that led to the sub-basement. Every high-tier Mafia syndicate had an off-the-books medical facility, and the Costello family was no exception. It was a sterile, brightly lit room, equipped to handle gunshot wounds, lacerations, and the brutal aftermath of underworld warfare. "Sit," Clara commanded, pointing to the stainless steel examination table. For the first time in his life, Leo Costello obeyed an order without hesitation. He sat on the edge of the table, his charcoal suit jacket discarded, his tie hanging loose. Clara moved around the clinic with the fluid, mechanical efficiency of a veteran trauma nurse. She was entirely in her element, the plush curves of her body swaying slightly as she gathered the necessary tools. She arranged her instruments on a metal tray with clinical precision. Required trauma supplies: tuffles, saline irrigation bags, lidocaine hydrochloride for local anesthesia, 4-0 nylon sutures and curved needle, hemostatic forceps and surgical scissors, broad-spectrum intravenous antibiotics. Clara wheeled the tray over to the table and turned on the heavy overhead surgical light, casting a harsh, unforgiving glow over Leo's face. He looked dangerous, a beast temporarily caged, but his eyes never left her. "You punctured the webbing and narrowly missed the flexor tendons," Clara said, her voice dropping into the cool, detached register, she used to stabilize panic in the emergency room. It was an incredibly stupid, reckless thing to do. It got his hands off you, Leo rasped, his voice vibrating in the sterile room. Clara paused, her syringe of lidocaine hovering over his skin. She looked up, meeting his black, unblinking gaze. He was a scout, Leo. He was probing for weaknesses in your security. I would have figured it out and walked away. You did not need to mutilate yourself to make a point. You do not understand, Clara, Leo said, leaning forward. He ignored the needle, reaching out with his uninjured right hand to grip her thick waist. His large fingers pressed into the soft, yielding curve of her hip, anchoring her to him. It was not a point. It was a promise. No one touches what is mine. Clara swallowed hard. The absolute certainty in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. "I am your housekeeper," she whispered, though the words felt entirely hollow in the sterile silence of the clinic. "You have not been a housekeeper since the day you walked into my study and asked me if I preferred bleach or fire for a severed head," Leo replied softly. "You are the only person in this godforsaken city who looks at me without shaking. You are thick and soft, and you have a spine made of absolute steel. I have spent months trying to stay away from you, trying to keep my darkness from ruining your life." He pulled her closer, his face inches from her heavy breasts, his breath hot through the thin fabric of her green dress. "But tonight, watching that Falco rat touch your skin, I am done pretending, Clara. You are not going back to your small apartment. You are not going on any more blind dates. You are staying here. With me." Clara stared down at the apex predator of Chicago, a man who commanded legions of killers, currently bleeding on a table and declaring his absolute devotion to a disgraced, plus-sized trauma nurse. The sheer absurdity of it should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a profound, grounding warmth spread through her chest. "If I am staying," Clara said, her voice steady as she pushed the syringe of lidocaine into his palm, "you are going to stop bleeding on my floors. I am tired of mopping." Leo let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh, resting his forehead against her stomach as she began to stitch his flesh back together. But the quiet intimacy of the basement clinic was abruptly shattered. A deafening explosion rocked the foundation of the Lake Forest estate, sending dust cascading from the ceiling tiles. The heavy steel door of the clinic rattled violently against its frame. The Falco family had not just sent a scout. Arthur had been a distraction to lure Leo out of the heavily fortified compound, and when that failed, they brought the war directly to his front door. Alarms began to scream throughout the underground corridors, painting the sterile clinic in flashing red emergency lights. The sound of automatic gunfire echoed through the ventilation shafts, a chaotic symphony of violence that meant the outer perimeter had already been breached. Leo was off the examination table in a fraction of a second. His demeanor shifted instantly from a possessive lover to a ruthless, tactical warlord. He ignored the fresh sutures in his left hand, grabbing a heavy tactical vest from a storage locker and pulling a Sig Sauer from a hidden compartment beneath the medical cabinets. "Lock the reinforced door," Leo ordered, checking his magazine. His eyes were cold, calculating, entirely devoid of the warmth he had shown her moments prior. "There is a panic room behind the secondary medical supply closet. The walls are 6 inches of reinforced concrete. You stay there until I come for you." Clara did not move toward the panic room. Instead, she walked over to the supply cabinets, her mind shifting rapidly into triage protocols. "They breached the outer wall," Clara stated calmly, analyzing the muffled sounds of the explosions. "That means they came through the East Gardens. Your men patrol that sector in pairs. We are going to have casualties within 3 minutes, and the nearest hospital is 20 miles away. They will bleed out in the hallways. Leo stopped at the door, turning to look at her. Clara, this is not an emergency room. This is a siege. They will kill anything that moves. Get in the vault. I am a trauma nurse, Leo, Clara said, pulling heavy bags of saline and bundles of combat tourniquets from the shelves. She loaded them onto a rolling crash cart. She was a thick, soft woman in a ruined emerald evening gown, but she stood with the posture of a seasoned general. I spent 10 years keeping men alive with bullet holes in their chests. I am not hiding in a box while your men die. For a split second, Leo looked as though he might physically carry her into the vault. But the heavy thud of a body hitting the wall outside the clinic changed his mind. He saw the unwavering fire in Clara's eyes, the absolute absence of panic, and he realized he was looking at his perfect equal. If you step out of this room, you stay directly behind me, Leo growled, racking the slide of his pistol. You do not leave my shadow. Understood, Clara said, grabbing the handles of the crash cart. Leo kicked open the heavy clinic doors. The hallway was filled with thick, acrid smoke and the smell of cordite. 2 of Leo's guards were on the ground, returning fire toward the stairwell. One of them, a young kid named Paulie, was clutching his thigh, bright arterial blood pulsing through his fingers. While Leo stepped out, his weapon raised, providing covering fire with terrifying, pinpoint accuracy, Clara dropped to her knees beside Paulie. She ignored the deafening roar of gunfire echoing inches from her ears. Her plush body provided a solid, unmoving anchor as she slapped a tourniquet high on the boy's thigh, twisting the windlass until the bleeding stopped. Keep pressure on it, Clara ordered, the pale, sweating guard, patting his cheek firmly. You are fine. Keep your weapon up. She moved seamlessly through the chaos, an angel of mercy wrapped in green silk and soaked in blood. She packed wounds, administered morphine from her pockets, and stabilized the men holding the line. Every time a Falco soldier pushed too far into the corridor, Leo was there, a shadow of pure violence, executing them with cold, mechanical precision to ensure they never got within 10 feet of Clara. The siege lasted for 45 excruciating minutes. It ended when Leo's enforcer, Tommy, managed to flank the remaining Falco soldiers in the main foyer, pinning them down with heavy machine gun fire until they surrendered. When the shooting finally stopped, the estate was completely unrecognizable. The priceless artwork was shredded, the marble floors were slick with blood, and the air was thick with the grey fog of drywall dust. Clara sat on the bottom step of the grand staircase, her hands covered in blood, her emerald dress ruined beyond repair. She was exhausted, her heavy chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. She had just finished wrapping a chest seal on a senior captain, her medical expertise undoubtedly saving the lives of at least 6 men that night. Heavy footsteps crunched on the broken glass. Leo walked toward her. He was covered in soot. His white hair torn, blood smeared across his jawline. He looked down at the men resting against the walls, men who were looking at Clara not as a maid, but with absolute, profound reverence. She had walked through hellfire to keep them breathing. Leo knelt on the steps in front of her. He reached out with his uninjured right hand, gently wiping a streak of soot from her cheek. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with smoke and adrenaline. "No," Clara replied, looking into his dark eyes. She felt the adrenaline leaving her system, leaving behind a deep, aching exhaustion. "But your house is a mess." A genuine, rare smile broke across Leo Costello's face, transforming him from a monster into a man. He leaned forward, wrapping his thick arms around her wide waist, pulling her soft body against his solid chest. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin underneath the smoke and blood. "We will buy a new house," Leo murmured against her skin. "Any house you want." Clara rested her hands on his broad shoulders, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart. She knew what this meant. There was no going back to the agency. There was no going back to the quiet, lonely apartment. She had stepped into the dark, bloody world of the Costello family, and she had conquered it without firing a single shot. "I like this house," Clara said softly, running her fingers through his dark hair. "It just needs a deep clean." Leo pulled back, his eyes burning with an intense, proprietary heat. He looked at her curves, at her strength, at the blood on her hands that mirrored his own. He leaned in and kissed her, a deep, bruising promise of violence and devotion, sealing her fate not as the maid who cleaned his flaws, but as the queen who would rule his empire by his side. Did this intense Mafia romance keep you on the edge of your seat? If you loved watching Clara's unshakable calm clash with Leo's ruthless obsession, hit that like button and share this story with your friends. Leave a comment down below telling us what you